This week, escalation didn't arrive with a missile strike. Instead, it arrived with posture changes. In Munich, American officials stood shoulder by shoulder with their European allies and said that the United States and Europe belong together, but not on autopilot. At the same time, a second United States aircraft carrier strike group was confirmed to be headed toward the Middle East, while Washington is preparing for another round of talks over Iran's nuclear program. That's not contradiction, that's leverage. And when diplomacy and deterrence move at the same time, the margin for miscalculation shrinks. Tonight, we separate the signal from the noise. Welcome to Signals Over Noise, and this is our first weekly intelligence briefing where we analyze global events through four lenses. Those being 1, actions, 2, messaging, 3, the audience they were intended for, and 4, the perceived outcome. This week, we're tracking 5 major signals across the conflict continuum. The first being the tone shift coming out of the Munich Security Conference. The second being the confirmed movement of a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group. The third being the U.S.-Iran diplomatic talks in Geneva. The fourth being Russia's continued pressure campaign in the Ukraine. And the fifth being growing internationalization of the Sudan conflict. But here's the real question. Are we watching escalation? Or are we just watching controlled pressure designed to avoid it? Let's start at home, because some of the clearest signals this week didn't come from overseas, they came from Capitol Hill. This week, the United States House of Representatives voted to terminate the national emergency that was declared by the President of the United States and has been used as the legal basis for the tariffs on Canadian goods. The vote passed narrowly, 219 to 211. And it represents a rare intra-party rebuke of the executive branch's trade authority. Now, the resolution still faces many hurdles. It may not ultimately reverse this policy, but the signal here still matters, because Canada is not a rival power. Canada is one of America's closest allies, its largest trading partner, and a foundational part of North American security architecture. When emergency authorities are used in ways that affect our allies, it reframes the relationship. So let's take a look at it through our framework. This is ultimately a non-kinetic issue, but non-kinetic does not mean that it has no impact, especially when we begin to look at the messaging over this. And we are seeing some mixed messages. The first, coming from the executive branch, signals economic assertiveness. Meanwhile, the legislative branch signals constraint and the preservation of our alliances. That creates some message friction inside of our own government. And then when we look at the language games that are being played, we can see that Canada is trying the game of partnership and economic integration. Meanwhile, Washington is increasingly playing the game of leverage and transactional sovereignty. These games overlap, but they are not identical. And when language games drift, alignment weakens. And this isn't just about tariffs alone. It's about whether North American economic policy is framed as a shared security system or competitive bargaining arena. And allies notice that distinction, especially at a time when the United States is asking those same allies for coordination on China, Russia, and Iran. Now, these are the 3 things to watch for in this situation. The first is, does the Senate take up this resolution? The second is, does Canada adjust its posture, either quietly or publicly? And this includes its potential trade reset with the People's Republic of China. And 3, do we see similar emergency authorities being used in other trade disputes? Because if so, this stops being a trade issue and it starts becoming a strategic signaling issue. Staying in North America, the second major signal this week came from the House floor during the Attorney General's testimony regarding the Epstein files. This wasn't just oversight theater. It was a stress test of our institutional trust. During the House hearing, members pressed the Attorney General on issues ranging from prosecutorial discretion to investigative transparency, particularly surrounding the politically sensitive cases. The exchanges were sharp. At times, they were even accusatory, and even further, they were mostly defensive. But beneath the back and forth, there was a deeper question. Is the Department of Justice perceived as operating independently, or is it just another political tool? Because in moments of high polarization, perception becomes strategic terrain. So let's run it through the framework. This is, again, another non-kinetic issue, but don't confuse it being non-kinetic as being low consequence, because institutions are a part of national power. The messaging was fragmented, and I think that's the most clear signal that came from this. Some lawmakers have framed the Department of Justice as compromised. Meanwhile, the Attorney General is framing the department as a rule of law-driven organization and maintains that it is apolitical. Two narratives, but only one institution. That is clear message divergence. Meanwhile, when we look at the games that are being played, one side is speaking the game of accountability and political exposure. Meanwhile, the other is talking about legal process and prosecutorial norms. Those are different games. And when the public sees two games colliding without a resolution, then the trust continues to erode. Here's why this matters beyond Washington. The strength of U.S. global influence rests partly on our institutional credibility. When America pressures foreign governments over corruption or rule of law issues, that argument carries weight only if our own institutions are seen as stable and impartial. Otherwise, we just look like hypocrites. If trust in our justice institutions decline internally, it weakens the strategic messaging that we can push out externally. Not immediately, but gradually, over time. And our adversaries are paying attention to that. So here are 3 things to watch over this specific issue. First, we need to watch whether their hearing produces concrete oversight actions, whether that's through subpoenas, reforms, or follow-up investigations. Second, we need to watch whether the Department of Justice messaging becomes more centralized and disciplined. Does it become less partisan punditry and more serious dialogue on the issues facing the Epstein files? And third, we need to look at whether these issues migrate from congressional debate into public polling, specifically when it comes to the trust that our public has in these institutions. Because once institutions and the confidence inside of them becomes a campaign issue, then it stops being oversight, and instead it becomes political terrain. From North America, though, we are moving south, because instability in South America doesn't stay contained. This week, renewed tensions in Venezuela are back in focus. Political repression concerns remain high. Sanction architectures are still in flux, and migration flows continue to pressure the neighboring states around it, specifically Colombia and Brazil. Meanwhile, external actors have not stepped back. China maintains deep economic penetration through energy and infrastructure financing in Venezuela. Russia retains most, if not all, of its security relationships with the country of Venezuela. And Iran has expanded diplomatic and energy cooperation inside of the country. Now, this isn't Cold War nostalgia. It's strategic access through economics. So let's run it through our framework. This is pretty low when it comes to kinetics. We're not going to see interstate war, or we haven't seen interstate war yet. However, we do see some increased border security actions and armed groups that are persisting throughout the region. When we look at the messaging, we see that it is once again mixed. That Washington is signaling conditional engagement tied to democratic benchmarks, while Caracas is looking at its sovereignty and resistance to external interference. These are different narratives aimed at different audiences. So let's talk about the audiences. Because with the United States, we're talking about democratic legitimacy and sanctions as leverage. Meanwhile, Venezuela is talking about its regime survival and anti-imperial framework. China and Russia at the same time, they're not even playing that game. They're playing a game of access, ports, energy, debt structures, and that changes the board. And why does this matter? Well, it's pretty simple. South America is often treated as a peripheral and great power competition, but it's not. Control of energy flows, critical minerals, and maritime access points in the Western Hemisphere directly affect the U.S.'s ability to have strategic depth in this area. And migration instability has direct political effects inside of the United States. When domestic polarization intersects with external strategic positioning, then our alignment weakens. And external actors notice the opportunity. So there's 3 things that we need to watch when it comes to South America. The first, do we see any easing or tightening of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela? Does Chinese infrastructure or port announcements happen to spring up in this area? And third, does the migration flow and border enforcement, does that cause any shifts between Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil and even Panama? Because instability plus external access equals long-term leverage. From the Western Hemisphere, we move to the primary theater shaping U.S. defense planning, the Indo-Pacific. Because regardless of headlines elsewhere, this remains the pacing challenge under the National Defense Strategy. This week, the signal in the Indo-Pacific isn't a single dramatic incident, it's just still posture and tempo. The People's Republic of China continues its sustained military activity around Taiwan, through flying sorties in its airspace, to its naval presence, to the gray zone pressure that it's placing on the small island nation. Now, this is not an invasion, and it's also not de-escalation either. It's just pressure. At the same time, regional security partnerships continue to deepen. Japan is expanding its defense budgets. Australia is integrating more tightly under the Australia, United Kingdom, United States framework. And the U.S. forward-basing posture remains central. This is strategy shaping over time. Now let's run it through our framework. In kinetics, we're seeing persistent gray zone operations. Military activity below the threshold of war, but above the peacetime normal. Beijing's messaging is consistent. Reunification is inevitable. Outside interference is destabilizing. Whereas Washington's message is also consistent. Deterrence, preservation of the status quo, and no unilateral changes by force. Both sides are coherent, and that's what makes this dangerous. When both actors believe they are defending international stability. Now let's look at the language game though, because even though both actors are coherent, there is some divergence. China is speaking in terms of sovereignty and historical destiny. Meanwhile, the United States is speaking in terms of a rules-based order and freedom of navigation. These are different language games. And neither side believes the other's framework is legitimate at all. And that's some structural misalignment, not tactical misunderstanding. And we need to know why this matters now. Every other theater, Europe, the Middle East, even parts of Africa, draw finite U.S. resources. Carrier strike groups can surge, but we can't be everywhere all at once. If a crisis does arise, or if it's stacked across different regions, the Indo-Pacific will become the stress test. And Beijing is watching not just what we say, but also what we do. It's watching how thin we are stretched across the world. Here are three things to monitor comes to this issue. The first being the People's Liberation Army's air and naval sortie frequency around Taiwan. Look at how persistent those gray zone activities are. Look for any joint exercises involving the US, Japan, or Australia that signal deterrence and reinforcement. Look for language shifts in the official People's Republic of China statements, especially references to timelines or red lines that we shouldn't cross. Because in the Indo-Pacific, escalation rarely begins with declaration. It begins with pressure normalization. From the Indo-Pacific, we move to a theater that's often treated as secondary until it can no longer be treated as such. Africa this week is a reminder that great power and regional rivalries don't stay neatly contained. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, a major undercurrent is the escalating rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, spilling across the Red Sea into the Horn of Africa, specifically Somalia, Sudan, and Ethiopia. This rivalry began with overlapping dynamics in Yemen, but it has since evolved into a broader contest for ports, base access, political influence, and security partnerships. So let's look at the kinetics. It's low to moderate kinetics. It's mostly indirect, but the proxy layer here does, in fact, raise the risk level quite a bit. And the messaging, we see that both Gulf actors are coherent. They're signaling influence and access, not ideology. Meanwhile, the language game is quite different. The Horn of Africa states are being forced to pick sides inside someone else's game, which fragments local politics and amplifies instability in their own countries. And this is why that matters. Because when external rivals treat the Horn of Africa like a chessboard, local conflicts become harder to settle and easier to prolong. Sudan's conflict continues to internationalize. Reuters reporting alleges a secret camp in Ethiopia training fighters for Sudan's RSF, indicating deeper regional entanglement in one of the world's deadliest wars. And in parallel, the Horn of Africa rivalry story links directly back to Sudan. Reuters reports that the Gulf Alliance states are backing opposite sides, turning Sudan into another proxy battleground. So let's run that through our kinetics. This is high, and it's very persistent inside of Sudan, with a widening external support layer. In essence, what I'm saying in layman's terms is this is a hot war. The messaging is that each sponsor frames its support as stability, but functionally, it is sustaining this conflict for even longer periods of time. Meanwhile, the language games that are being played is that Sudanese factions are playing for their survival. Meanwhile, the external actors in this situation are just playing for influence, and those games don't resolve anything, they just prolong the conflict. In eastern Congo, Reuters reports the United Nations mission is preparing reconnaissance flights to support ceasefire monitoring around the country. And this is tied to the ongoing instability and conflicts inside of the Congo. This is a reminder that even when there's a ceasefire in place, the tactical situation can outrun diplomacy, and local alliances can shift pretty fast. And one more signal worth mentioning, and that is that the African Union Summit that we recently mentioned opened amid growing youth frustration with something that the Associated Press has described as, quote, block of old leaders, end quote. And this is reflecting a widening legitimacy gap between the youth of Africa and the current political elite. And that legitimacy gap adds a vulnerability, because instability is fueled as much by governance as by credibility and bullets. So here are three things we should watch when it comes to the continent of Africa. The first is there any additional evidence or response surrounding external support pipelines into Sudan? The second thing we should watch is, do the states inside of the Horn of Africa, are they being pushed into some sort of formal agreements by Saudi Arabia or UAE? And three, we should watch whether the Congo ceasefire monitoring becomes real restraint or just a temporary pause. From Africa, we move to the Middle East, where posture and diplomacy are advancing in parallel, and that's the signal. This week, multiple reports confirmed the United States is deploying a second aircraft carrier strike group toward the region, centered on the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group. This would place another U.S. carrier strike group inside or near the Arabian Sea alongside the existing carrier strike group, which is the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group. And that's not routine at all. At the same time, though, Washington and Tehran are preparing for another round of nuclear talks in Geneva. The United States is increasing its military posture while keeping diplomacy open. And that is not a contradiction, that is leverage. So let's run it through the framework. In kinetics, we're seeing elevated posture, but no active large-scale strikes or operations at the moment. Carrier strike groups get to provide flexible air power, ISR, and strike capabilities. They also signal credibility without immediate use. Meanwhile, the messaging is pretty clear amongst these actors. The U.S. message is that negotiations are preferable, but our military options remain on the table and very credible. Meanwhile, Iran's message is that sanction pressure is illegitimate and deterrence will be met with resistance. Both sides are coherent on this matter internally. So the risk is not confusion, the risk is instead a miscalculation. Now let's look at the language game alignment between the United States and Tehran. Washington speaks the language of deterrence and compliance. Meanwhile, Tehran speaks the language of sovereignty and resistance to coercion. These are structurally different games. When naval assets operate in proximity, signaling errors become very costly. Here's why this matters beyond the Middle East. Carrier strike groups are a finite resource of U.S. power projection. When two are positioned in one region, it means that there is somewhere else in the world that lacks the coverage of those carrier strike groups. And this affects global force distribution pretty significantly, including the Indo-Pacific, where deterrence is our primary goal. And it's not just Iran that watches this, and it's not just our allies that watch this either. Beijing watches this, Moscow watches this, and they watch this because posture communicates what we are prioritizing as a nation. And prioritization also signals what our bandwidth actually is. So these are the three indicators I want you to watch when it comes to the Middle East. First, change in any tempo or posture from the carrier strike groups themselves. Do we see a heightened state of alert with America's sailors and airmen that are operating on them? 2, public statements from Tehran ahead of the Geneva negotiations. 3, any oil market issues that are tied to the perceived escalation risk. Because escalation rarely begins with a declaration. It begins when leverage turns into action. After the Middle East, we turn to Europe, because this week, the real strategic question is whether the alliance system can maintain coherence across multiple simultaneous crises. And Munich is where that is being tested publicly. At the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Marco Rubio delivered the clearest U.S. message so far, that the U.S. and Europe belong together, and Washington does not intend to abandon the transatlantic alliance. But Europe also needs to change course after what he described as policy mistakes. Europe's response has been cautiously optimistic in this regard. Leaders welcomed the reaffirmation of unity while still emphasizing Europe's need for greater strategic autonomy. At the same conference, the European Union Commission President pushed a sharper European signal that the European Union should bring to life its mutual defense commitment, framing it as a binding obligation, not an optional task. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine lane, President Zelensky reiterated that elections can occur only after a ceasefire with adequate security conditions met, while also emphasizing that security guarantees must precede a settlement. When we look at the kinetics, we see that Europe remains in a high-stakes, real-world security environment, and Ukraine continues to face Russian strikes and pressure dynamics. Meanwhile, when we look at messaging, we see that the US message is coherent. We are with you, but not in the same old way. While Europe's message is also coherent. We want you, but we're building independence regardless. And where this gets interesting is when we begin to examine the language games being played. This is the friction point. The US language game is shifting towards conditional partnerships and institutional reform. Meanwhile, Europe's language game is shifting towards autonomy as insurance against the unpredictability that the US is bringing with it right now. And when we look at the outcome risk here, right? If both sides keep saying together, but at the same time are simultaneously investing in separate operating models, then what we'll get is coordination drag just as the crisis tempo is beginning to rise. So there are 3 near-term tells coming out of Munich. And these are the 3 questions I want you to keep your eye on as the weeks move forward. Are there any concrete commitments, not just speeches? And this can take the form in air defense, industrial capacity building, or sustainment across the board. Does Ukraine get cleaner security guarantee pathways tied to any ceasefire discussions? And the third question, does the alliance produce one coherent public narrative? Or do we just see 2 parallel ones? Here's the signal across every region this week. Escalation isn't just about weapons, it's about alignment. In North America, institutional trust is the terrain. In the Indo-Pacific, sustained pressure is the strategy. In Africa, proxy rivalry is prolonging conflicts. In the Middle East, deterrence and diplomacy are running parallel. Meanwhile, in Europe, Munich exposed a repair effort, but also revealed that unity now comes with conditions. So the question for next week is simple. Can the US sustain coherent messages across multiple theaters, while allies decide whether to double down on integration or instead to hedge their bets? Because when alignment holds, escalation can be managed. And when alignment fails, better outcomes become impossible. That signals over noise. If you found this useful, share it, follow it, and I'll see you next week.